Our next speaker is Zeiher, and she is a senior lecturer in human services at the very difficult for me to pronounce, the Ware Wanaga Wataha University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and she is a Lacanian analyst in training. Her work focuses on Lacanian psychoanalysis, feminist and political theories, as well as music and creative writing. So let's welcome Cindy. Okay.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm audible. Great. Thank you so much, and greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm sorry I can't be there. We're in the thick of the teaching term at the minute. But I am excited to be able to share some provisional thoughts regarding an ongoing project which focuses on the music philosophy nexus. So presently I'm tarrying with the viability of how the music philosophy non-relation can be thought via psychoanalysis. And what I am proposing are some provocations, some ideas on how music can be a condition for philosophy, given that music often presents the most difficult philosophical problems and arguably is a philosophical problem. So specifically, I'm going to be looking at Adorno's position on music as an ontology in which musical tools, composition, listening, performance, and so on are understood as sets of relations which hold these tools together. And I argue that Adorno's more nominalist, so my apologies, emphasis on authenticity is where music fails to be a condition for philosophy. At this conjuncture, I claim that Sumit Ria's redeeming of this failure in her chapter on Adorno and Badiou allows for music and philosophy to condition each other. And here I use the example of Franz Schubert, the classical composer, and specifically his Lieder to illustrate the music philosophy nexus, which has the function of listening for the uncanniness of the signifier. So I begin. I'd like to start by recounting a letter composer and philosopher Vladimir Yankelevich writes to his music teacher friend, Ward Raveling, and I quote, when I leave music to turn to philosophy, I feel as if I have returned from a journey out of the realm of the irrational, and I am less convinced than ever of the reliability of words. Much earlier in his Music and Ineffability, Yankelevich claims that philosophy, and again I quote, has no preamble. The whole of philosophy is a single preamble from beginning to end. It is a constant introduction. It leads the mind into something else. And this without end. One might say that philosophy, this constantly new beginning, is the constant continuation of a never-ending introduction. We might add that unlike music, there is no prelude to philosophy, which speaks for itself and has no need to set an intention for what is about to take place. Given that its discourse exists fully within the desire to elucidate an idea or prepare for a different idea. Because music seems more reliably self-conditioning than philosophy, Yankelevich eventually found himself at an impasse and needing to decide whether to be a composer or a philosopher. For him, this impasse is set within the context of the aesthetic genealogy of modernism, which was bound up with recurring questions about the status of ontology. He grappled with whether there was a space for an ontology of music of which philosophy should be a part. For philosopher-composer Adorno, music has the potential to directly confront the listener with truths of their existence as produced by ever-changing social forces, yet at the same time is being hijacked and corrupted by the secular culture industry. Furthermore, by espousing a conception of high and low culture, perhaps Adorno was trying to redeem the devaluation of music in Hegel's idiosyncratic listography of aesthetics. Adorno recognized that serious music was facing the interrelated pressures of both the market and the musical public. He saw the development of large companies which controlled the distribution of music as leading to what he calls the disposal of artistic trash, because their overriding profit motive necessarily courted the musical taste of the larger section of the musical public. As a result, as Adorno says, and I quote, "In order to survive, some composers pretending to be modern adapt to mass culture through calculated feeble-mindedness. Worse still, less technically able composers were now able to have glorious careers." His lament continues. "Dilettantes everywhere for the first time are launched as great composers, musical life, which by now and large economically centralize the forces the public to recognize them." Although the same frustration of demarcation might be said for other artistic and thinking fields, the charge is here much less obvious and perhaps even less consequential. Music has been the topic of philosophical debate since the ancient Greeks and continues to slide in and out of focus. Although music is perhaps best described as simply organized sound in time, we can say that musical notes are resultant from a cultural selection of what is determined as meaningful sound within the whole range of perceptible sounds for the human ear. Therefore, music consists in negative spaces, intervals separating the different sounds that compose musical phrases, and likewise the distances between these sounds that make up chords of harmony and sequences of rhythm. These relationships and their combinations form the foundation for musical sense and sensibilities. More simply, music is a dynamic drive of linking and unlinking in repetition. It is the interface between the body, the musician, composer, listener, with the environment of listening. It is more arbitrary, less accurate than painting and poetry because it doesn't reproduce or describe reality. Rather, it makes attempts to imitate it sometimes. Music's modus operandi is that there is always an aspect of it that is untranslatable via tone or meaning. And it is this radically ineffable character which philosophy sometimes grapples with. Philosophers prefer to focus on specific conditions of music, such as aesthetic properties or political and social conditions, not of all which are necessarily discernible, even to those who love music or philosophy. From the perspective of music, in order to philosophize about it requires not only, I think, love, appreciation, and sensibility, but also the desire to seek knowledge about music, how it is composed and performed. Being a universal form of expression, music is obviously a necessary condition for philosophy. However, it remains one which is just not always easy for philosophy to grasp. As Yankelevich says of music in his Ineffable, music means nothing and yet means everything. One can make notes say what one will, grant them any power of analogy. They do not protest. In the very measure that one tends to confer upon music the dimension of depth, music is perhaps the most superficial form of appearance. It is Sumitriya's curiosity about the conditions which enable music to appear, which leads her to pitch Badiou against Adorno, an opposition which I contend centers on Badiou's refusal of the ineffable as a condition for knowledge. For him, there is no ineffable preventing us from arriving at knowing that which we do not know, but instead certain concrete conditions which plug up the space of that which we call the ineffable. Here for Badiou, the real predicate of an ethics of the other is not the ineffable but interventionist truth, which occurs in the domain of thought. We might nevertheless question whether Badiou's ethic of truths represent a principle of operation, not so far removed from ineffability in that the ineffable presents truth, often sensorial, through inspired yet abstract thought. After all, love is one of his conditions. For the ethical subject unable to subsume the ineffable, the likely reaction would be indifference, refusal, or negation of ineffability as a given position for which everybody has the capacity. This is why Badiou's refusal of the ineffable is nevertheless a provocation for the thinking subject who accepts music as a condition of philosophy, which it should be, he is not explicit about. With what we are grappling regarding the music philosophy nexus, the romantically coloured aesthetic synthesis of the past has given way to today's materialist research, which, although not aspiring to cover all of music aesthetics, perhaps offers a more graspable contribution to the study of music and its contexts. Does this imply the end of a philosophy of music, like the one of art anticipated by Hegel? Certainly not all music is art, and not all music aspires to be art. However, contra Hegel, there is a way in which to counter the alleged non-relation between music and philosophy, one in which psychoanalysis is complicit. Either music becomes wholly thinkable, or it remains just out of reach, not only in terms of its aesthetics, but also because language itself is ultimately insufficient to fully address this proximity. Interestingly, perhaps this is why Freud could not really resonate with music, or so he says in his confession in the Moses of Michelangelo. And I quote from Freud, "I am no connoisseur in art, but simply a layman. Nevertheless, works of art do exercise a powerful effect on me, especially those of literature and sculpture, less often of painting. I spend a long time before them trying to apprehend them in my own way, that is, to explain to myself what their effect is due to. Wherever I cannot do this, as for instance with music, I am almost incapable of obtaining any pleasure. Some rationalistic or perhaps analytic turn of mind in me rebels against being moved by a thing without knowing why I am thus affected and what it is that affects me." Such musical indifference is a fascinating symptom, and not that uncommon, especially if we approach music as more of a form of becoming rather than structural. Insofar as the language of music demands, commands, and refuses to be fully interpolated into linguistic grammar, it can create a sort of boredom or dread, like that experienced by Freud. And yet music is a shared encounter in time, between people and disciplines. Italian psychoanalyst and musician Mauro Manica takes his cue from Freud's essay on transience, when he claims that because music is opposed to the synchrony of spatial arts, it enigmatically continually folds and unfolds along the linear path of time, giving shape to one's inner and outer worlds. Just as our understanding of the place of music as an extimate space is always changing, so also have our philosophical approaches to it. Music for the Greek philosophers was connected with their metaphysic of how they thought the universe was structured. In the Middle Ages and after, secular music was considered as simply entertainment, but sacred music was a means to an end in the aiding and praise of worship of God. In the late Renaissance, music as a topic for philosophy reappeared, founded on early Greek philosophies, minus its structural involvement in the universe. Since then, intermittent changes in the philosophical approach to music have occurred, including the tension between music and philosophy as identified by Yankelevich and Adorno. In her reading of Adorno, Sumitria notes something very important, that because music is a nearly universal human activity done in order to perform all sorts of social functions, the whys, whats, and hows of it cannot be addressed until after the musical act, whether performance, composition, or listening, has occurred. This is consistent with Adorno's contention that it is the analysis of music rather than its interpretation that provides the key to serious philosophical inquiry into it. For Adorno, analysis examines the structure of a piece of music ranging from individual notes and phrases up to how the piece as a whole confronts, mirrors, and contradicts or conforms with the social milieu it inhabits. In Adorno's essay entitled Schubert, published in 1928 in a special edition of Die Musik, marking the centenary of Schubert's death, he develops concepts regarding Schubert's formal musical procedures that inform his understanding of Schubert as the mimic par excellence. Schubert composed prolifically from a young age and left an extraordinary oeuvre including symphonies, operas, chamber music, and sacred music, and above all, more than 600 Lieder. Schubert wrote in such a way that any voice can sing most of his compositions. With only a few exceptions, his Lieder can be transposed to suit the timbre and range of all voice types. An important aspect to note about the performance of Schubert's songs is that any vocal extravagance must be avoided. One needs to cultivate precise technique to sing Schubert, and this entails that not only should one know one's voice inside out, but one's voice must be in complete service to the words and the music so the character of the voice can be encountered and examined. One is in service to Aristotle's mimesis in the classical sense, the identification with the protagonist when performing Schubert. For Adorno, mimesis is a creative synthesis of two dichotomies, the instincts of life and death, as derived by Freud, and those of self-preservation and letting go, as derived from Kahlua. However, in his 1944 Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno departs from these by equating mimesis with the death instinct and development with the life instinct, yet without entirely abandoning the dualisms of Freud and Kahlua. He instead constructs a new opposition within mimesis, wherein mimicking death is embodied in the, and I quote from Adorno, crystalline form, the landscape of death, through which Schubert's wanderer aimlessly moves, and mimicking life emerges from Schubert's very different musical landscapes, in which nature, reconciled and blissful, opens up the prospect of regeneration. In this way, Schubert's music carries the irrational hope of all those whom Adorno perceived as mimics, from Schubert himself to all freedom-loving wanderers throughout the world until the end of history, who would one day in the hour of regeneration come to life and thereby defeat death. Of Schubert's musical intention vis-à-vis mimesis, Adorno says, and I quote, "The crucial difference between inspiration and invention is perfectly exemplified in Schubert. Invention prevails through constructive power deriving from subjective existence and form. Inspiration shatters form through disassociation, where it communicates with subjective intention." A recurring theme in Schubert's huge output of Lieder, that idealized nature might be in fact a destructive cultural burden, manifests through the narrative of innocent young people initially seduced by the romance bestowed by nature and living a carefree life, being unexpectedly confronted with imminent death, at which point for them nature horrifyingly transforms. In Schubert's Lieder Death and the Maiden, Der Tod und das Mädchen, and El König, the music at first lulls us into a delightful sense of security. But as time passes, a disquieting command to listen becomes increasingly urgent, and we realize that lurking beneath the romantic gesture of taking nature at face value lies a violent counterpart. At their climax, these lieder blend parole, what is uttered, with verb, the presence of what is sung, in a visceral, anguished, and destructive cry, which forces us to consciously manage the experience of listening. Here, the illusion that freedom and nature have an innate moral alliance is shattered in a devastating realization that nature was never on our side, nor indeed was God. The maiden in Matthias Claudius's poem dies at the hands of the devil who has seduced her, and the young unnamed boy in Goethe's poem, Erlkönig, dies as a result of some supernatural force. They both die blameless, yet with death as having the potential to manifest itself in any particular moment, subverting their innocence. Claudius's poem is designed as a dialogue, contrasting a young woman's fear with the reassurance of death. He creates opposites and connections between these two figures. I just want to read out two stanzas of this poem. First, the maiden, and then death's response to her. Maiden. Over, oh, over, go wild, bone man. I'm still young, go, dear, and don't touch me. Death. Give your hand, you beautiful and delicate figure. I am a friend and do not come to punish. Be of good cheer. I am not wild. You shall sleep softly in my arms. Similarly, Erlkönig allows us to appreciate how the rational and irrational forces us into stark realization, especially when Schubert insists that all three characters in Erlkönig, Father, Son, and the Ghost, are sung by the same vocalist. So I'm going to read verse 7 from Erlkönig, first in German so you can hear the metered lyrics, and then in English. Ich liebe dich, mich reiße deinen schönen Gestalt, und bist du nicht willig, so brauch ich Gewalt. Mein Vater, jetzt fasst mich an, Erlkönig hat mir ein Leid getan. And in English from one of Edgar Bowing's translations, I love you, your beautiful form excites me, and if you're not willing, then I will use force. My father, he's touching me now. Erlkönig has done me harm. So it is upon this one word, Gewalt, force, which marks the change in musical temperament between father and son, one that is intensified and becomes ominous and desperate. Musically, at this point, the composition changes, for those who are interested in this, from E-flat major to D minor, marking this mysterious character, Erlkönig, as an uncanny force beyond conscious subjectivity, beyond words, even though spoken by the boy and the words of the father, who doesn't trust them. Goethe and Schubert's preference to uphold the fantasy of the name of the father, even in death, is a striking philosophical move. The immateriality of Schubert's lieder lies in the idea that language alone is so abstract, it needs music to emphasize its incorporeity. Sensorially, I think of Schubert's lieder as sounding air, as residing in between music and poetry, or a clashing of temporal time in real time. Here I agree with Adorno's claim of Schubert's genius, but for different reasons. Schubert was not only a restless composer, not entirely at ease with the historical time he found himself in, but also a philosopher of inventive melodies and employed musical intervals as metonymic points of departure. In Erlkönig, we listen to a conversation between a child who demands to be heard, a father who dismisses his child's words, and the consequences of this. It is in the interval where the signifier Gewalt resides as a psychic functioning of repeated linking and unlinking, or more poignantly, of life and death drives. Here it seems obvious what philosophy has to offer these astonishingly powerful leader. It should be remembered that at the time of composing Death and the Maiden, Schubert himself was dying. Perhaps, therefore, this music is not only an articulation beyond language, but also, when facing death, an expression of our fate, as Lacan puts it, of being captured and tortured by language. The philosophy of nature, so often darkly portrayed in Schubert's Lieder, reminds us that our subjectivity has no natural allies, even those of history, nature, or God. Sumitria's position that music not only is but should be a condition for philosophy circumvents the question, what does philosophy have to do with music? For to deny a priori including music in a philosophical system ignores the reality of their connectedness and cannot therefore be the most fruitful of prospects of positions for either music or philosophy. For example, those contemporary philosophers who enjoy discussing Wagner and his music have certainly good reason to do so, for his music can be dangerously divisive as well as unifying. But to pitch Wagner as the philosophical name for music is perhaps a bit bombastic and not entirely flattering to philosophy's capabilities to think music. Perhaps Dvorak, whose symbolic nationalism is seductive to the listener and curious for philosophy, is also just as, if not more interesting, especially since he was so eclectic in his approach. Less fashionable is the notion that music is a condition of philosophy because it too offers insight into the human condition via a more deliberative life practice. That is, in simply only thinking about music, one inevitably hits an impasse. And this is certainly the case for many dedicated musicians and composers, and also for those philosophers who don't scorn the concept of philosophy as a lifelong contemplation of artful living. Adorno's contribution to Schubert scholarship has elicited little response from contemporary research, perhaps because apart from mimesis, this displays a literary rather than philosophical or psychoanalytical interest. However, Adorno does make an interesting observation on Schubert as a musical genius who, quite distinct from the dominant line of development in Western classical music initiated by Beethoven, created an entirely authentic, philosophically reflexive oeuvre. Adorno interprets Schubert's works as landscapes of sorts, in which one might wander and where wandering is associated with dying. That this is where Schubert himself wanders is evident in the way he conceives and treats his themes. According to Adorno, whereas Beethoven sets themes in motion through their oppositional character, Schubert's themes remain essentially static, that is, stuck to melodic forms, which Adorno concludes are merely fit for repetition. If we are to find music as a condition of philosophy in Adorno's writing on Schubert, we need to look no further than his rejection of Bloch's teaching on the immortal soul as facing the very destruction of the world. That also fascinated Schubert. Adorno's interest in Bloch centers on the latter's concept of wandering and death, discussed in the final chapter of The Spirit of Utopia. Here, the relationship between wandering and death emerges from the dead soul's supposed ambivalence about returning to life. Bloch conceives death as the beginning of the soul's great wandering, wherein the prospect of returning to life is tightly bound up with searching for one by sifting through a lifetime's accumulation of what he calls bourgeois debris. Bloch believes those who spend their entire lives wandering as strangers to themselves have at least this as a compass with which to navigate towards a better afterlife. Bloch was not particularly interested in Schubert's music, but Adorno recognizes in Bloch's metaphysics the same wanderer who inhabits the composer's static musical landscape. Although music is perhaps closer to psychoanalysis than philosophy, philosophy arguably needs music. Psychoanalysis might have directed Adorno towards Schubert's psychic struggles, but in his essay Schubert, he superimposes on the model of anguish that of landscape and horizon, because for him, Schubert's music reflects not so much the organic unity of anguish, but rather the contradictory landscape which is experienced and deceptive. Although Adorno implicitly references psychoanalysis by linking death with wandering, his inspiration for this, although not explicitly stated, might well be those passages in Schubert which associate wandering with the tension between a sense of not belonging and a desire to belong, between the unavailability of one's place and the insistent nostalgia for it. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the death of French composer Gabriel Fauré, who asked, "What is music?" There is something untranslatable about this question, something mysterious, and yet Fauré is occasioned as the composer who ended Romanticism and ushered music into modernism. Fauré, like Bach, Beethoven, Schubert, and many others, broke a lot of musical rules, and they did so in the name of this unanswerable question. There is a certain tenuousness music harbors with philosophy, which philosophy also tarries with. Adorno's reliance on Freud in his interpretations of Schubert's work would thus be marginal, even negligible, had it not been Schubert's insistence on composing philosophical questions about what constitutes a good and bad life or a life worth living. Psychoanalysis could only direct Adorno to Schubert's trauma and dreams as guidelines for his musical and aesthetic interpretations. But in his essay Schubert, Adorno juxtaposed the model of psyche with that of the natural world. In his opinion, Schubert's music reflected not the idealized organic unity of psyche with the natural world, but the landscape of life and death as directly shaped by mimesis and repetition. Such an anti-romantic maneuver makes way for identification with a specific life intention, a philosophical condition. Sumit Rea claims that philosophy as a given exists and insists because of its lack of self-realization. Being in this way incapable of death, we are always acting in the name of a philosophy which endures beyond us. Furthermore, philosophy's condition for thinking are ever present, always in the here and now. Just as music, as all musicians know, is always in time, so also philosophy has no need to secure its place in time. Music is a human condition which outlives all those musicians who dedicate themselves to composing or mastering their instruments, as well as all music lovers who can identify a moment in time through listening to music. This is precisely the drive and trauma of music composition, music making, listening, and thinking about music. Sumit Rea suggests that notwithstanding Adorno considers philosophy out of time, thereby providing the opportunity to act responsibly, nevertheless we can assert that music, always being in time, thereby opens the door for philosophy to similarly consider itself a given. Sumit Rea takes this further by invoking Badiou's four conditions as a solution to the risk of philosophy being left destitute, whilst at the same time noting that music is not one of these conditions, but close enough. However, for Sumit Rea, music does appear to be a condition which directly confronts and unites with philosophy. Time and again, Schubert wrestled with this very insistent confrontation, using the figure of the wanderer as a compass with which to navigate the dark and light of life. One needs to prepare for the dark while still in the light in order to ascertain a destination. This is precisely Schubert's maxim, and how I read Sumit Rea's insistence on music as a condition for philosophy. They wander around each other, keeping each other sensible or in sensibility with each other. Although Sumit Rea contends that music is a condition for philosophy, this does not require that all philosophers can or should talk about music. Music can sometimes express something about philosophy and vice versa, which Sumit Rea respects as a struggle to which, without needing to justify itself, philosophy needs to respond. Music, as Yankelevich states, has broad shoulders. And it is at its most sublime when time seems to stand still, when one feels willingly stuck in time. When this pause in consciousness of time passing is so acute, it transforms into time of a different order. In this way, I read Sumitriya's condition of music for philosophy as responding to the drives as a libidinal development of incompatible temporalities. This is what makes music an idiosyncratic language which shares with psychoanalysis the function of making the irrational comprehensible, the unconscious a bit more conscious. If music begins in timelessness and is characterized in and by time, then music's fixation on time should be more than a philosophical curiosity. It should be a condition. After all, the rhythm of philosophy as out of time with itself assumes eventual, shattered time, enigmatic, unconscious time, as well as those moments where nothing happens, empty time, as a question of the shared signifier between philosophy and music, time. So did Yankelevich really need to set up his choice between philosophy and music in order to stake a claim about his bewilderment? Either way, he was a philosopher who composed, as well as a composer who desired to express ideas about what it meant to compose. After all, he did write one of the most influential books on music and philosophy, and put to work how we can think about music's untellability. As Sumitriya points out, music and philosophy are curious about each other. They condition each other, and moreover, they have much to reveal and expose to and about each other. They both create a space in which one should awaken and wander. It is the perfect non-rapport, in which the other is always invented and reinvented, and more importantly, keep each other's motives in check. We could say that philosophy and music are cathartic for each other. They keep each other honest in both eventual and textual senses. Lastly, moreover, music has the potential to enable us to act with the psychoanalytic charge that we have all the time in the world, which is for music a fantasy worth preserving. The music philosophy non-rapport is characterized by the psychoanalytic event. The hammer hits the mirror, and the subject is left to pick up the pieces. Schubert was not afraid to confront the horror of the human condition as both a philosophical question and as a lived condition in which one's day of reckoning constantly beckons. For him, much like the philosopher, one lives out this day of reckoning as an enigmatic alter ego. This is the common thread by which philosophy and music can, through linking repetitious tension and unlinking release with each other in their own good time, turn to each other as conditions, enabling the subject to at least prepare for whatever is unexpected or indeed inevitable. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks, Cindy, for this, very insightful paper on the relationship of music and philosophy. Are there any questions? Immediate? Then yeah, okay, Jan.
Okay, hi Cindy, can you see me? Can you hear me? No, she can't. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly fine, yeah.
Okay, so, well, thanks first of all. I've a minor remark that kept me thinking. It's not really a question, but I was wondering about the, so listening to your wonderful description of the, let's say, procedure of music, and about the, let's say, its dialectical tension between the body and the environment, the body of the musician and the environment of the other side, and then relating it to the concept of condition via Yelitz's text in the Badiousian sense. I was wondering whether there is perhaps a tension in your understanding of the condition between something like, let's say, that on the side of philosophy, something is happening like thought or thinking something and getting an understanding of something. And then on the other hand, condition, yeah, well, what is, what might be happening in the condition? And to put it differently, and I was actually thinking that your description of the well, procedure of music was a perfect description of what Badiou would call thought. No, I mean this is thought in the Badiousian sense because precisely it has no object, but is rather an organization of space and time from and within itself via a certain, let's say, disruption, no, or a certain split, and so. You could argue on, so this is, I mean, there I simply had the impression that there is a slight tension. For Badiou, I think the thought is never abstract or something, no? And what philosophy does is only to try to give a reconfiguration of what has been thought in the condition. So music or the condition is thought. That was the first thing. And then I was wondering also, because you stressed or you emphasized a certain, well, closeness of the relation between music and psychoanalysis. And then, and here I had the second, and still, I mean, it's not really a question, but here I had also the impression, I mean, you could say, what about the, now I'm missing the English word, the notation, the Noten, Herrgott nochmal. You know what I mean. So even in music, there is a necessity of a very strict understanding of the written musical lines, no, of the Notenheit. Yeah. So, and I had the impression that in your understanding of music, you were pushing this necessity of the signifier a bit to the side to open music in terms of something that is, let's say, as if it were uncoupled from the question of the signifier. Do you know where I'm getting at, or I'm trying to get at? Can you? Something as if there were more this sort of abstraction on the side of philosophy and something as not abstract but bodily presence on the side of music, and I'm doubting that. My question is actually, isn't there so the question of abstraction, if you want, on the side of music precisely in the, it's still not there, Noten. Tell me what Noten is. Can somebody relieve me from
notation,
this? Score.
Yeah, so thank you, Jan. That was a lot there. I think we're really on the same page when I listen to you. The signifier that music and philosophy have in common is relative to the repetition and time. So, and this was precisely what I was interested in regarding Adorno, was how he tarried with this problematic of repetition and time. And in order to do that, he had to understand it within high and low culture, music as being produced, and either musical composition would somehow subvert the conditions in which it was composed, or it would just simply reflect it. There's lots of, for musicologists, there are a lot of problems with this, this particular account, not to dismiss Adorno's reading of music, and that, but rather there is music has always been popular culture. Even Adorno's more preferenced musical tastes were popular compositions for in various circles. Regarding the signifier, you mentioned that it I somehow obfuscated it. But what I was attempting to do was to bring this Adorno problematic regarding repetition in time as a signifier that philosophy and music actually share. They both grapple with it. And this is one of the ways, for the way that I have always understood music. And I have to say that I'm coming from a very particular standpoint as somebody who performs music, whose interests are in certainly performing and listening to music. I choose Schubert because I find him very interesting as a composer, but I listen to a whole range of genres and music. So, but specifically, I'm interested in how I think music has always asked philosophical questions. I think that there seems to be I don't necessarily think that sometimes philosophy, I think it struggles with music for a variety of different reasons. And I'm wondering, and I was reflecting upon Rourke's paper on demarcation and aesthetics, and I know that he was really speaking to Rancière at that particular time, but it really did sort of perhaps give me some ways in which I could think about this problematic. Regarding Badiou, I totally agree with you. What I was interested in Badiou was his refusal of the ineffable, which I find really fascinating. A lot of music and philosophy rests upon this ineffability. And so that's why I appreciate Badiou, because there is always the potential for a space, an interval, a pause to be thought. So I think that in a way, Jan, you and I are saying the same things, and I hope that responds to your two comments.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I also have a question here, and mine would relate to Jan's question in a certain way, but focus more on on this in between, of music and philosophy, or music and psychoanalysis. And I wonder if you, because you were describing the meeting ground essentially as the category of time and the processuality of music, and also now in saying, music is always popular music, but there is also a kind of, transition, exactly in the period of Schubert, what Lydia Gare was, for example, describing as this, upcoming of a category of the artwork in music, that music starts with one note and ends with one, and it's not a kind of ongoing improvisation. So I wonder, you mentioned this, the wholeness of artwork in Adorno once, but otherwise you did not refer to this category of the artwork. And I think it would be very interesting to discuss as a meeting ground, as a special signifier in itself, this category of a work in terms of music and philosophy, and maybe also for psychoanalysis. Is there a work in psychoanalysis? Would be, I think, a very interesting question. Yeah. So I would like to hear what your approach to that kind, if there is a difference between this kind of modernist, focus on the artwork and the romantic and avant-garde traditions of dissolving it. We can't hear you now.
My apologies. I'm going to be annoying and say yes and no. Schubert was ill at ease with the Romantic period in which he was composing. composers should be ill at ease in the time that they are composing. And that should concern them. It should trouble them that they are composing out of time. So the idea of the present, the here and now, and the category of the note or the composition or the is one which is timeless. This is why Schubert's work, Death and the Maiden, and his Lieder, Erlkönig, are so today are so revered. Specifically, I mean, although I didn't speak about it here, I've done a musical interpretation of both of these Lieder. And one of the most interesting ways in which Schubert approached the Lieder was that he really gave the voice, the language, he preserved the poet's voice, but he did not give the poet the last say. So when we listen to Erlkönig, for example, the boy dies, but the music continues, and it's almost as if the music signals the end of the poem, and rather than the voice does. And I think this is kind of Schubert's genius, in a sense that he was able to prolong the question around the human condition, the willingness to really listen to each other, the problems that we have in terms of relations with each other, and so on. He was able to kind of almost give it a punctuation musically, let it endure, and let it kind of distill for us. So I see in a way that is him being very ill at ease with what other composers were doing at that particular time, and also preserving and giving a space to the intertextuality of poetry and music, but more specifically, particular poetry that asks philosophical questions, in which music can also respond to these questions. So I hope that kind of gives an example of perhaps how the categories can relate to each other in and out of time being the signifier.
Okay.
Thank you, Helm.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. You need a mic.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your speech. I have a simple question. I think maybe outside your topic, but nevertheless, I ask the question. You spoke about the popular music, and you spoke about Schubert's music. It seems to me quite different, because I thought about popular music as popular music, for example, in the Nazi songs, and popular music which are making the groups coherent. And so I think it's a difficulty, because in these groups, people are becoming like animals in herds. And this, with this kind of popular music, people are more in this kind of groups. And this is, I think, a little bit, not a little bit, quite outside of the prospect of philosophy and psychoanalysis. What do you think about this popular music as promoting the group sensibility and the disappearance of the singularity of people.
If I can understand your question correctly, are you asking something around how popular music has the potential to hystericize? Is that the question? I just
I
want
would not
to.
say hysterize, but to put the people in big groups and people losing their singularity and their questioning, which is the stake in philosophy and psychoanalysis. So the people are members of a big group and they lose their singular identity.
When you were speaking, I was reminded of Freud's work on group psychology.
Yes.
And how he specifically speaks about this, and also in his work on civilization and its discontents, where people are drawn to rules, regulations, and so on, regardless of what they are, and but specifically why they conform and why they obey. And I think that music has had and does play a role in such conformity, but also in it can be much more thought-provoking. I'm imagining that you're sort of coming from a position where people are drawn together and are more willing to give up singularity in the name of some sort of collective jouissance via popular music, perhaps, if I'm understanding that correctly. But I do think that at the same time, there is very much a singularity to the experience of listening, performing, and composing that I don't think can be so easily lost. I think on the side of music, it would be absolutely essential to retain it as much as one can. Even works that are repeated over and over again, where people are reinterpreting them by replaying them. I hope that I'm able to ask that, answer your question.
Okay, thank you. We have one more short question. Yeah, Rock?
Thank you, Cindy. So just, yeah, the question of the conditioning of philosophy through music and your use of both Badiou and Adorno. I was wondering, Adorno often has this, when he talks about art and particularly music, he uses his way of music conditioning philosophies often quite divisive in a certain sense, like to which point in history something is possible and not possible anymore, or simultaneously you have Stravinsky and Schoenberg, and which way will philosophy go? Who will it follow? And so that's one way of looking at it. And in Badiou, there's more, when he has that notion of I don't know, what's it called? When there's a sequence of artworks and that makes its own moment, or what's the word he uses in aesthetics, so that you have like these periods where centered around a certain new invention in art, and then there's a certain sequence and then it ends. So it's not just like there's truth in all music, but in certain sequences here and there. And so I was wondering, in what sense do you see this singularity of musical works as influencing or conditioning philosophy? Or do you see it more in this Adornian divisive way, or more in this? So just if you have any thoughts on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, I'm conflicted regarding Adorno. I think that Adorno was in many ways a stunning musicologist, but the points of disagreement are they have consequences. He really dismissed some very important moments in musical history. Regarding Badiou, music is not a condition, and his emphasis on Wagner, which a lot of philosophers take up Wagner, is I find interesting and problematic. I think that there are a number of different composers who are in the name of philosophy. I'm not terribly sure. I would like to. I think of music as a collective orientation. The singularity, much like the philosopher, for philosophy, the philosopher is right. For music, the composer is correct. So that is where the singularity lies with music. And that gives the musician, the listener, a lot of agency, actually, in trying to figure. When I think of, say, Bach, he sets up problems, philosophical problems for the performer to try and figure out as they go along. So singularity is always there, but what music is the very function of it is to connect, is about provocation and collectivity. So and that's what makes it universal.
Okay, thank you very much, Cindy. And yeah, I'm told there is coffee. Oh yeah. Okay, we make a 10 minutes break. Yeah, if that is okay. Yeah, but we should start when right in 12:16. Yes. Because there's fresh coffee now, so we can grab that and then we continue. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.